It is always a joy to be here at Navigating Motherhood. I love this ministry. So, welcome to you all, and let's talk about our subject today. I just want to start with that, the reason we founded Cornerstone was because we were just not thrilled with what we were seeing out there in the school classrooms. We wanted to make sure that when we put our kids into school, that we could focus on what we knew God deemed to be of great importance. And that is obviously biblical character and moral skills. I was going to say I'm hearing an echo, so I'm not sure. Anyway, so biblical character and moral skills, right? So we started our own school to make sure that that was the priority, and we were trusting that if we did what God considered to be a top priority, that it would benefit our children for their lifetime, and that was important to us. We had that end goal in sight. And so those principles included, obviously, respect and consideration for others, obedience, the ability to focus, and of course, self-control. And actually, self-control kind of encompasses everything else, doesn't it? Because how can we be obedient if we don't have self-control? How can we focus if we don't have self-control? So this sounds very different from what we're hearing today in the world, right? Modern psychology is filling up the ideas of parents, making them believe that their kids are not capable of learning these kinds of skills at an early age. And they are convincing parents that when you try to do it, you're putting too much pressure on them as if it's going to damage them. And I can assure you, ladies, it's a lie. And I don't think they're intentionally trying to lie, but that's what it is. It leaves kids handicapped in their ability to grow in maturity. And as the lack of self-control continues and becomes habitual, then it is something that is going to end up affecting their lives for the years to come. The reason these are considered moral skills is because, excuse me, the Bible instructs us to practice them. So that is, moral skills are having to do with the inner man. So that is the heart, the mind, the soul. And those are the things that drive our behavior. And so we want to pay attention to those. All skills are developmental. So you have non-moral skills, which are things like riding a bike, learning how to write your ABCs, all those kinds of things. And then you have the moral skills, which are the character and the godly behaviors. All skills are developmental, and all that means when somebody says something is developmental is that it needs to develop. So you develop it through practicing it. So in fact, how many of you have taught your kids sign language? Anybody in here? Yeah, quite a few of you, right? And probably before the age of 1. Every time your child chooses to use sign language rather than screaming or crying for what they want, they're practicing self-control. That's fantastic. Before the age of 1, right? We had a little guy at Cornerstone. His name was Will. So sweet. He was a middle child with 3 other siblings, and his mom completely understood the value of teaching self-control. Will was 5 years old. He was in kindergarten, and we all came into school one day, and we were overwhelmed by the smell of lacquer. And we're thinking, where did this come from? What happened here? So we're running around trying to figure it out. We're opening windows, keeping the doors open, turning all the fans on to get it aired out so that we can get our kids into the classrooms for their day, right? So everybody's in the classroom. I'm in my office doing my work. And all of a sudden, the kindergarten teacher comes flying through my door. Sharon, Will is in the school office. The paramedics have come, and he is having a hard time breathing. And I spring out of my chair and I race down the stairs. It was during a time when I could do that. And I ran into the office, and there's the paramedic. He's on his knees in front of little Will, and little Will is sitting in a chair, and the paramedic is trying to get the oxygen mask on him. And I can see Will's lips. They are blue. This is not good. He's not getting enough oxygen. And so he's hooked up now with the mask. And the paramedic begins to ask him, Will, he says, can you explain to me what happened? And I'm thinking, this is a 5-year-old. He's overwhelmed because he's not breathing, right? And the paramedic is asking him these questions. So no sooner does he ask Will the question, Will very calmly removes the mask from his face, and he says, well, I am having difficulty breathing. And he puts the mask back on his face, and he's eye contact with the paramedic who is speaking to him, right? Very grown up, very grown up. And you could see the paramedic, he kind of catches his breath and he turns to me and he's fighting the smile that's coming up, and he goes back to Will again and he says, Will, can you tell me, when did you begin having difficulty breathing? And Will again, very calmly, takes his mask off his face and he says, well, yes, sir, I first noticed it about an hour after I got to school. And it just kept getting worse. And he put the mask back on his face again. Now the paramedic does full body turn to me, eyes like saucers, and he goes, who is this kid? He's amazing. And then they continued working with Will. They got him on a stretcher, little Will, on this great big stretcher, and they wheel him out to the ambulance, and they shift him in and stick him in there, and there's this little guy in there, and I'm waving goodbye. Bye, Will, your mama will meet you at the hospital. And Will's waving back at me. And they close the door, and the paramedic turns around and he looks at me and he goes, I can't believe this. He says, I've worked on adults in less crisis than this kid who could not give us the same focus, the same self-control, and the same consideration. And he goes, I am just blown away. So off they go. And Will, of course, goes to the hospital. And we heard reports later that he got excellent care at the hospital, as you can imagine, because he's in there just blessing everybody, right? Whatever they need to do, Will is letting them do it. And he's being taken care of. So his breathing, they get it under control. He's released from the hospital with lots of friends following behind. And the next day, we were back in school, all of us. Fortunately, the church had moved the lacquered shelves that they had painted or whatever, lacquered, and they put them outside, which was what a great idea that was. Could we have done that the day before? And, you know, nothing significant happened at school. We were all fine. The only change that occurred was we now had an EpiPen in the school office. So, super fun to see these kids. And the interesting thing is, Will was not the only one. We had a whole school of kids, and of course, different levels. They weren't all as good as Will, but a lot of them were. And this was because we had a whole school of parents that were focusing on these biblical skills, right? These moral skills. And so it could have been another child in that seat doing the same thing. And what we need to understand, ladies, number one on our outline, is that self-control is a gift that keeps on giving. So let's define self-control so that we're all on the same page. And as I give you this definition, I want you to think about Will and what he went through. So self-control is the ability to control oneself, in particular one's emotions and desires, or the expression of them in one's behavior, especially in difficult situations. Did Will fall into that definition? I think he did. I think he could have written it. Even at 5, he probably could have written that. And because this is a very unpopular topic these days, as I was preparing for this talk, I decided I'm going to dig into the internet. I'm going to see what they're saying out there about self-control, because we don't hear about it very often. So I started digging in, and amazingly, the only thing I could find was situations where people had become, and this was usually adults, so angry, right, that they were becoming a threat. And so then they were working with these people on self-control. I would say that's a little late to start working on self-control, wouldn't you? So I kept digging. I kept thinking there's got to be more out there. And I came across this report, which was an amazing report. It's called the Dunedin Report. It was a multidisciplinary health and development study, okay? It was based in New Zealand, and it followed the lives of 1,037 babies. It started as babies who had been born between the years of April 1st, 1972, and March 31st of 1973. So they were all in the same age, right, within a year. And they started this study when these kids were 3. They have evaluated, because it's still going on, these people 13 times over, they were up to age 45. So 13 different times they were evaluated, more often in the early years and less often in the later years. And they're actually continuing with this, so they will evaluate them again in their 50s. So it did not begin as a study on self-control. But as the years went by and as the people hit their 30s, all of a sudden they started to see a picture in this study that they could not believe. It was clear, it was concise, and they realized that significantly, those who had practiced self-control had lives that were going well, and those who did not practice self-control were struggling. So without going into every detail of this report, because there are a lot, we saw, you can see, and I will share with you, that there were specific areas that they struggled with. So they struggled in they all had financial difficulties, they had higher crime convictions, they had lower life and parenting skills, and they had high divorce rates. And I'm sure predictably, you could guess that they also had higher suicide rates. These are all the ones, and they weren't looking for this. This is what they gathered. Yet today, ladies, we aren't even talking about self-control unless you're sitting here at NAVMA with me. So based on these overwhelming findings, we need to understand, number 2 on our outline, lacking self-control draws judgment and consequence. So I want to show you how that works. For each of these statistics, there are authorities behind them making judgments, and there were consequences for all of the choices. So those with financial difficulties were making bad choices, and so their consequences were they had difficulty securing home loans and business loans. They were considered credit risks. And so the authorities behind those judgments were the people in the finance world. You had advisors and bankers who get paid to make judgments to decide who they're going to loan money to and who they're not going to loan money to, right? If they're out there loaning money to anybody that wants it, what's going to happen? Our financial industry is going to collapse. And then there were those who were the lawbreakers, right? And the authorities behind those judgments were police and judges and jailers, right? And they also are trained to make judgments on people and what should happen with those people in order to keep society safe. Aren't we glad that there are some people hauled off to jail? We should be. That's for our protection. And then consider those who are void of life skills and parenting skills. Now we're talking about a second generation here, right? And both they and their children are suffering because of their choices. And the authorities and the judges behind those statistics are the teachers, school administrators, psychologists, doctors, child protective services. Everybody out there dealing with children, right? Dealing with how people are living their lives. And they are serving the world by protecting children in society. Our culture has grown to disdain the idea of being under authority and judgment. It's a hot topic today, right? And people protest and they politic it all the time, believing that they can do away with these systems or make a difference and stop the judgment, right? They believe that authorities, judgments, and even consequences should be gone or should be lightened up, right? But this is just never going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is because there is a designer of these elements of judging and of authority, judging, and consequence. There's a designer. So even in the most historical documents, when you go back, clear back, and the Bible is one of them, you will see judicial systems, right? They're just set up. And in fact, we are even instilled with the ability to sense when something is just or unjust, right? So when we're going through our day, we're making decisions and choices all the time. And we are judging what our children are doing, what they're not doing. We're judging what we're going to put on each day, what we're going to wear. We're judging what we're going to do for dinner. We're judging if the person in front of us is going to cut in on the freeway. We're making all kinds of judgments all the time, right? And that ability to judge has been placed in our conscience. We are able to understand good from evil and right from wrong. And if something is evil, we're appalled by that, right? It distresses us. And that is because our designer has placed that in our hearts. He's given us a conscience to understand that. In fact, in Romans 13, 1 and 2, it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." Those are words for eternity. They're not going away. So let's take a closer look at the non-negotiables. So letter A, there will always be an authority making judgments. We just need to accept that. We can try to live in a society that strips the value of teaching self-control from our children, but we cannot change the truth that for those who do not practice self-control, they will be under an authority, they will be judged, and they will suffer consequences. It will make the difference as to whether they will live a good life or a devastated life. It's a choice. We need to understand and that humanity needs to be under authority and consequences. That is our protection, and that is what God has instilled in our world to keep us safe. And your child needs to be under your authority because you are going to be the picture of what they're going to deal with out there in the world. And they need to be able to trust you in that loving authority that you have over them, and to apply consequences when it is appropriate to apply a consequence, right? You do not want your child going out into the world and being shocked by the consequences that they face because they never learned how to be self-controlled, right? They are going to be under authority. They are going to be judged by their behaviors. And our second non-negotiable element in this is every action equals consequence. It's another element that God has established. It's like gravity. It's not going away, ladies. Every action equals consequence. A good action is going to bring good consequence. A bad action is going to bring bad consequence. And those who fell into the statistics of lacking in self-control, what happened? They are living very serious consequences for that. And those who were making right choices, they're experiencing great consequences. Their lives are established and they're doing well. So parents can either go with the culture and convince themselves that our children will eventually grow out of their issues with self-control and they'll straighten themselves out. But we have a 40-year study that is showing us that doesn't happen, right? And we need to recognize how vital it is for our children to be trained in self-control. If dad and mom apply these two non-negotiables in their home, and they become a right authority for their children who are making right judgments for their children, and they apply those thoughtful, considerate consequences, your child is going to end up being one of the few in the culture to come, because considering the attitude and the temperature of where our culture is right now, yours will be one of the few who are out there actually living a life and doing well. And I'm not saying there's not going to be crisis in their life and there's not going to be trouble in their life. There will be, obviously. But they're going to be able to walk through it in a way that is successful and victorious. So, number 3 on your outline, self-control must be effectively trained. So here's what we're waiting for, right? Let's figure out how to do this. So when we embrace the truth of these two non-negotiable elements, we allow those truths to become our motivation in training our children, right? Knowing this, knowing that there's always going to be authority, there's always going to be judgment, there's always going to be consequence, should motivate you to say, okay, that's going to start with me in my home. So where do we begin? Well, there's a framework we can start with. And that framework begins with biblical love. And I say biblical love because biblical love is different from any other type of love that's out there. And it is the ability to be able to look beyond yourself and do for others and be a benefit for them. So when we tackle parenting that is not convenient for us, right? But we do it anyway because we know it's highly beneficial for our children, we are biblically loving our children. And then on the other hand, when our children are treated like they are the center of the universe, then we cannot be surprised when they grow up living selfish lives and being a pain to other people, right? If it's all about them, everyone else is simply there to serve them. We have to be careful with that. In contrast, when our children understand that they have been created by a God who loves them, who has a plan for their lives, and they understand that under his authority, because he is their maker, and they get that concept, right? Because you've taught it to them, Don't be surprised when your child's desire and ability to do the right thing is heightened. Kids are very spiritually responsive. They are. It's always blown me away when I work with kids, how easy it is for them to believe and to understand. And when our children are treated as valuable members of the family rather than the center of the family, and are expected to be an equal benefit to those in the family, right? That's unheard of today, but that's what we should be doing with our families. Everybody in the family needs to be a benefit for one another. And then your kids begin to understand that rather than being the constant problem in the family, they become the solution to the problem in the family. That's great for them. I mean, think about little Will, right? And his respect and self-control, even in the most difficult situation. It makes sense when you realize that he was being encouraged in all of these moral skills and especially self-control. We saw that. So when Will's mom needed to correct Will or any of her other children, she started with 2 questions. She went to them and said, were you loving God? And were you loving your neighbor? In that instant, the child is judging themselves, right? She didn't lecture. She didn't have to even identify necessarily what he was doing. He was judging himself, and he needed to come up with an answer. That is the beginning of learning self-control. Is bringing to the child to the realization, am I loving God? Am I loving my neighbor? The next level in our framework is to consider 5 targets of respect. And of course, the first one is God. We want them to respect their maker, right? God made them, and so obviously he is their authority, right? And we want them to respect the elderly. I get to fall into that category now. Especially grandma, right? And people at church, like on the church patio or anywhere you're at, and there's elderly, you want your children to be respectful of those people, not running around knocking them over, but, actually taking notice that there's a walker there, right? Or a man with a cane. And they're being careful with the elderly, and they're offering the elderly a seat, or they're opening their door for them. They're showing the elderly respect. Our next one is respect for authority, right? That means dad and mom, that's the first. Be that authority for your children because they're going to learn from you what it is to respect authorities. And when they're not respecting you, and if you're not correcting that, then they're learning it's okay not to show authority respect. You've got teachers, right? You've got pastors, you've got paramedics, you've got peace officers. Anybody in their life that has charge over them is an authority. And we want them to learn to trust those authorities and to be self-controlled. So we have peers, right? They have to respect their peers. That's unheard of today. But they do. They need to think beyond themselves and think of what is good for the other person. So they need to learn to bear with one another in love. Treat them well. And the final one, which seems to be out of place, doesn't it, is property. Why would property be there? Well, if you have a kid and he comes into someone's home and he goes directly to the sofa and uses it as a trampoline, he is not treating the property well, right? But there's an owner of that property. So there's a person who purchased that sofa with their hard-earned money, chose that sofa because it was the right one for them in their home, and hopes to have that sofa so that when people come to visit, there's some place for them to sit that doesn't have springs popping out all over the place, right? So property becomes one of our targets of respect, not because of the item, but because of the person that is attached to the item. So we're going to move past this, even though there's more to say, but I am going to tell you that I have a blog on my website, and it's called Only One Commitment, Biblical Respect. And so if you want to learn more about how you can implement respect with your kids, go to the blog and have fun. It won't be exhaustive, but it'll help. It'll get you started. So having established this, the next question you ask your child is, to whom did you fail to show respect? Sorry, my throat is getting dry. This is another judgment question, isn't it? Where the child has to stop and go, who wasn't I showing respect to, right? They have to judge their own heart. And they have to take responsibility for what they've done, which is so good, right? They're taking responsibility for their behavior. And thank you. Aw, my daughter-in-law taking care of me. She's so sweet. All right, so let's see. So yeah, they're taking responsibility for their own behavior, right? That's a part of them learning how to be self-controlled. They start to judge their own behavior. So again, consider little Will as he would remove the oxygen mask and respectfully answer his authority. It's so sweet, right? Which isn't the reason why we do it, but it is so sweet. And Will was given compassion. He experienced really good consequence because of his ability to be able to show people that kind of love and honor and respect. People were genuinely touched by him and by his kindness. And that takes daily practice. You know, Will didn't just wake up that morning and everything went well for him like that. His mom had been working on that with him since he was a baby, right? So when your child has been disobedient, rebellious, or selfish, these are actions that we should be bringing consequence for. And so parents, we have to faithfully apply the consequence. So remember, both elements are necessary in training because both elements are non-negotiable, right? Don't send your child out into the world to find out that he's going to pay consequences for his wrong behaviors. That's shocking. That's where you get your victim mentality, where they go out, they're shocked by the consequences, and they think everybody is being unfair, and life does not go well for those people. You don't want your child to be one of those. Don't handicap them in that way, right? And if you have a hard time trying to figure out consequences, rather than me taking another half hour to explain that, I can send you to the blog again, and there is actually an article, so you'll have to get to the blog page, scroll all the way down to the bottom, and there's an article called Discovering Related Consequences. Okay, and when you click on that, you'll be able to download the article. And that'll give you some really good ideas on how to think through consequences and what you can give them. So let's look at some of the practical ways to grow them in self-control. We need to understand that when our children have too many freedoms, which I would say every child today has too many freedoms, right? Just because that's the culture that we live in. But what that does when we allow them to have too many freedoms is we set them up for failure, right? Because they cannot be successful when there are too many freedoms in their life. They can't manage that yet. So we have to be careful to establish boundaries in their life and be faithful with those boundaries with them. And as they get good within those boundaries, you can open the boundaries. That's the goal, right? Until they get to the point where they're taking the keys and driving down the driveway and waving goodbye at you, right? You know that they have learned to respect boundaries. So you teach them through good discussions that you have with them, right? And when I say discussions, that means you're talking, yes, but you're also drawing out their thoughts. You're having that conversation. It's not a full-blown lecture, right? You're just daily having these good discussions. You're reading good character books to them. I love that because so much easier for a child to judge the character of a person in a book than it is for them to judge their own character. And so they get practice with this by reading good character books. And then role play with them, moms. We know that when we role play, they learn so much. So switch positions. Sometimes you play the little child and let them be the adult, and sometimes they play the child and you be the adult. And then boundaries that we're going to discuss will have to do with time boundaries, physical boundaries, and verbal boundaries. So time boundaries, and everybody's going to just close off right now and shut down, but I'm going to tell you this anyway. You know, time boundaries means we're going to give ourselves a schedule. You're already on a schedule. You know when your child wakes up in the morning. You know when you're going to feed them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks. You know what nap time is. You know all of these things. So get your schedule out. Put those blocks of time in there. And now all you have to do is fill in what falls between those, right? And it's really good. So in case you need help with that, I have a blog for this. So it is called 5 Activity Stations for Family Peace. So that's going to give you some ideas of what you can be doing with your little ones. And then we're going to go to physical boundaries. Physical boundaries are the first one I put down, which I think is so important because it's just not being practiced today, is sitting. How do you get your children to sit and stay in one place? I heard a more liberal parenting, I guess you could call her a coach, say that if you can't get your kids to sit down and listen to the story, just run after them while you're reading the story. Oh man, we have gone too far on this, right? What child is even listening to that? So begin with what we call blanket time or playpen time. What you're doing, you can lay a blanket down, and what you're doing is you're giving your child the boundary of the edge of the blanket. And so you're giving them toys in the blanket, a few toys, not a lot, a few, so they can be creative, and a couple of books to look at. And you start them with 5 minutes, set the timer, and you can do this with babies. 5 minutes, set the timer, and then if they have victory, then that's fantastic. You can up it to 10 minutes the next time. I have friends through the years, lots of friends that used this technique. I used it as well. But I would have moms come and tell me that they had meetings at church and they didn't know what they were going to do with their kids. So they laid the blanket out and they'd have 2 or 3 kids sitting on the blanket with their own little toys, and peace throughout the meeting, able to get through a 2-hour meeting with no problem at all. So, I mean, it's wonderful. You can take that blanket anywhere you need to go, and they can practice that kind of quiet time there. Respecting specific areas for specific activities in the home. Unfortunately, our homes have become one big giant McDonald's playland. And it shouldn't be, ladies. That's your home. It's yours and your husband's home. You are the primary relationship in that home. You should have a nice home to live in. You should be proud to invite people over to your home and be hospitable, right? And not have people clear toys off the couch to sit down. So you start to set up areas in your home that's the play area, right? They're not going to drag toys all over the place. And then what about crossing boundaries? Like So in the kitchen, we had a little threshold between the dining room and the kitchen. And if I was in there, and pasta was a big thing in my home, if anybody knows me, we always had boiling water on the stove. I did not want the little ones in the kitchen. So the boundary was the threshold going into the kitchen, and they knew that they couldn't do that. Of course, they weren't perfectly obedient. Michael would jump over he was my middle child. He would jump over the boundary, and Tori would stand there with his toe over he was my compliant child, so just the toe would be over the boundary. So you have to train them, right? It's not going to be perfect system, but you can train them. And when you set up boundaries for them, they start to realize that, again, they are a member of the family. They are not the center of the home, right? So they have to learn to respect different areas. I did not remove items from my coffee table because I wanted my kids to understand that they don't touch certain items. There are things they're allowed to touch. There were things they weren't allowed to touch. That's fantastic. My coffee table looked nice. When somebody walked in, it was okay. It was nice. That's a good thing, you guys. So sitting peacefully during mealtime, right? Do any kids do that anymore? No. They grab a couple bites, they jump out of their chair, they run around, and mom and dad are usually chasing after them. So much for the family meal, right? Get back to the family meal. That's an important time. Have your child sit and learn to sit through the meal. And if they don't do it right now, build up to it. Do 5 minutes, then get them to 10 minutes. And pretty soon, you've got a wonderful family meal for an hour long, just having great conversation and enjoying each other. Sitting peacefully during reading, right? That's fantastic. Whether they're snuggled up with you or whether they're sitting in front of you actually focusing, right? That's a good way of teaching self-control. But either way, teach them to be quiet and to sit and to listen and to focus on the story. And start with a very short book, obviously, and pretty soon you'll be in chapter books with these kids. And then also during video time, videos should never be on if they're playing. They should be sitting, watching a video, sitting, focusing, right? Watching a video, no toys. So you should have a video or a television spot in your home with no toys, right? When you allow children to play and be active while the video is playing, you are teaching them not to pay attention to the voice. If you teach them to sit and listen to the voice, guess what's happening? They're becoming learners. This is good. We practiced a personal bubble, right? So we said, you have a bubble around you. Everybody's got a bubble around you. And you're not allowed to jump into somebody else's bubble, again, Michael, without permission, yeah? And they can't get into your bubble without permission. Wonderful boundary, wonderful boundary. And then let's do verbal boundaries. Verbal boundaries are so necessary. So speaking and quiet at appropriate times, when to speak, when to be quiet, right? There's times for that. It's okay for you to designate that for your child. It's not okay for them to speak and scream and yell and do all of that anytime they want, right? We all had to learn to respect other people and speak when it was appropriate to speak. What about whining? Anybody have trouble with whining? It's the same thing. Show of hands. But it's the same thing, right? We can train them not to whine. Whining is basically a complaint against mom or dad. That's what it is. I don't like what you're telling me to do, or I don't like what you said to me, or I don't like the food that you gave me. And so I'm whining. Well, that's a form of rebellion and disobedience. And so that should have a consequence, right? So practice quiet times. I had, again, Michael, in the car, I would come home after a long day at school, a gazillion things in my head going on, trying to figure out how am I going to solve these problems and how am I going to get us home on the freeway. And Michael would be in the back, and anything that went into his eyes came out his mouth. If he saw it, he was going to talk about it. And so his little voice was going on and on and on and on. And of course, your mom heart, you want to pay attention. You want to listen. But there has to be a boundary for that, right? And so I started to teach Michael, honey, you know how we have personal bubbles? Yes, Mama. Well, we also have a mental bubble. And I said, you need to be conscious of the fact that there's a mental bubble. And when you jump inside, like let's say, jump inside Mama's mental bubble, I can't think. And I need to think because I need to get us home. And he said, okay, yes, Mama. So he was still talking. We were working on it. But I told him, we're going to practice quiet time. And that took some time to do. But we would do 5 minutes at a time, and then we would up the time on that as well. That's where the self-control comes in. And it doesn't happen in one day, right? It happens on a regular basis. I remember Michael coming home one day, and he's talking and talking and talking, and I'm in the car just, thinking, are we going to get home? And all of a sudden, I'm at the point where I'm about to say, Michael, it's quiet time. And Michael's chattering away, and all of a sudden he says, Mama? And I said, what, honey? And he said, I think it's time for quiet time. He had developed a sense of when it was time to shut down. And I said, I think that's a good idea, Michael. And so he was quiet the rest of the way home. It was great. So they do learn that self-control. Also, what is an appropriate decibel? Now, I don't have to worry about this too much anymore because I'm too old to hear those really high decibels. But you girls do not want to be, even at the park, hearing that kind of screaming going on. And so we begin to teach our children what are the decibels that are appropriate, inside and outside, both, because inside is going to be far less than outside. But outside also has a limit. And so we work on that, right? Again, we do that through role-playing, discussion time, right? The back and forth, and storytelling. Those are all great ways to practice those things. And then another helpful blog, in case you need it, is called Parenting Choices, Abandon What's Easy, Promoting What's Right. So ladies, we've scratched the surface here. I know I've probably spoken too long this morning. I'm sorry about that. And we still have barely scratched the surface. If you want more, I would highly recommend jumping into our parenting class. We go for 14 weeks. It's jam-packed every week with information, very usable, practical information. And so if you want it, check it out, and it'll fill in some of the holes that we're missing today. So just over the expanse of what we just covered today, what do you think? Is it worth considering training your child in self-control? What do you think? I would say little Will's mom thought that it was worth it. She trusted that if she taught Will self-control, that his life would go better. And in fact, you know what happened to Will? Based on what we learned from the Dunedin report, we would have to guess that it went well, right? Things should have gone very well for him. So let's take a look. Here's Will and his mom today. Will is newly married. I didn't put the little picture of his wife up there, but she is a cutie. And he is now, listen to this, goes on for a while. He is now a captain in the U.S. Army. After graduation from West Point, he earned his Army Ranger tab and then served as an officer in the 82nd Airborne. He is currently at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, training to be part of Special Forces as a Green Beret. Will's mom told me that Will is an extremely hardworking and diligent young man, and that he has certainly established his adult life. His self-control has taken him much further than his mom ever expected that it would. And I'm sure that the things that she is the most grateful for is the fact that Will is a glory to God. He glorifies God through his life, and he is such an enormous benefit as he serves the people of this nation. So, ladies, training self-control is attainable, regardless of the age of your child. Do not wait. Jump in. Start today. You only have to value the idea of self-control in order to implement it in your life. So thank you very much for having me today, and I pray your discussion time is full.